Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens with mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yerna Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Dr Meghan Tinsley. Meghan is a Presidential Fellow in Ethnicity and Inequalities at the University of Manchester, as well as being the author of Commemorating Muslims in the First World War Centenary. Thanks for joining us, Meghan.
Thanks for having me.
I guess just to begin with, this book's been released through Routledge's Memory Studies series. Could you tell us what are memory studies?
That's a good question. It's a big question. Memory studies is a small, but I would say growing and increasingly interdisciplinary field that examines the way that the past constructs the present and also the way that the present constructs the past. So, for example, I'm interested in the way that states, nations, and activists call upon the past and remember particular events that enable them to make sense of the present and to give rise to a particular political program or a particular set of values in the present. Memory studies also looks at the way that groups and communities form and construct shared identities. So we get the sense of who we are, a general we, if we have a notion of a shared experience in the past, even if, and I would say especially if it's not something that people have experienced directly and can remember directly, but if it's the memory of past generations and say a set of events that shaped the way that people see their contemporary values in the present. So for me, memory studies is linked to the study of nationalism and the study of empire, but there are also subfields of memory studies that look at the intergenerational transmission of memory within families and communities. So it is really a broad church, and it's a field that I think really helps us to understand where we are collectively in the present.
Your book focuses particularly on the commemoration of World War I in the UK and France. What was it about this commemoration that you felt lent into your area of research? Why this and not other things?
Definitely. So one aspect of it is the timing. The First World War was a watershed moment in collective memory in general. In Europe, it marked the democratization of memory. So prior to that, if you were a soldier, a private soldier who died in the war, in any war, you would probably be buried in a mass grave if you were buried at all. If you were an officer, you would probably be transported home and buried in an elaborate family plot. But at the end of the First World War, there was the mass erection of monuments in town centers and churches with individual names. And importantly, across Europe, governmental bodies committed to maintaining individual tombs and individual headstones and to respecting the graves of former enemies. So this was a moment when, within Europe at least, memory became something that was collective, that was national, and was also individualized in a way that it hadn't been before. Now, 100 years later, Britain and France, in addition to other European powers, were marking a major anniversary of the war when there was no longer any real sense of living memory. So in both countries, by the time the centenary rolled around, there were no longer any living First World War veterans. Harry Patch was the last British veteran. He died, I think, in 2008. So the institutions that were responsible for mounting the centenary were very aware that they were actively creating the memory of the war. So children who were growing up during the centenary weren't growing up hearing their grandparents tell stories of the war. That memory was no longer living. And they saw this as an opportunity. So institutions like the Imperial War Museum, for example, closed for long periods of time and radically refurbished spaces and created new exhibitions of the First World War. And a similar process played out in France, although there it was a bit less centralized, played out increasingly at the local level. So I was interested in the First World War because the centenary marked a moment of memory making. At the same time, as you can tell by the title of the book, my focus is on the commemoration of Muslims in the First World War. And I came to that topic largely because of my own ignorance. I had studied post-colonial theory, and I was particularly interested in the racialization of Muslims at the beginning of the 21st century, such that ideas of Britishness and Frenchness increasingly were constructed in opposition to this imagined Muslim other. But I didn't understand until about a year before the centenary, when I was doing exploratory research for my PhD, that Muslim soldiers under the auspices of the British and French empires had played a major, significant role in waging the First World War. And they had been actively and passively written out of history thereafter. So the centenary marked a moment to reclaim that memory, to reclaim that history, but it also meant that people who were making those decisions had to choose a particular narrative to pursue. So that raised the question, would Muslims be represented as, say, loyal heroes who had sacrificed their lives for the empire? Would they be represented similarly to white soldiers, particularly in Britain, as victims of war, as people who had fought and died in the trenches for really this meaningless war that only led to the Second World War? There were decisions to be made about how a marginalized minority that had been erased from memory would be rewritten into the past, and by extension, how they'd be rewritten into the present. So as the centenary approached, I saw this as really a pivotal moment in imagining British and French Muslims in the past, and in turn, imagining the role of Muslims in the contemporary nation. So it really held high stakes for the memory of the past and for imagining the present.
Meghan, what's remembered and what's forgotten is shaped, as I think you note in the book, very much by contemporary concerns. What sorts of concerns were brought to bear in terms of commemorating the centenary of the war, and how did, I guess, the contemporary situation of Muslims in Britain and France inform those decisions?
So I think a lot of the tensions of nationalism and this question of what constitutes an us, in quotes, is clearer in retrospect than it was at the time in 2014. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that the centenary largely failed as a nation-building exercise in both Britain and France. If the goal was to create a sense of social cohesion, to create a clear sense of an us, a national us, then both nations are much more openly and violently contested now than they were at the beginning of the centenary. Your question was, what were the tensions of the nation at the beginning of the First World War centenary? And in particular, I think you were asking what was really the status of Muslims in national memory in both countries.
Yes, and how the contemporary situation of Muslims informed the kinds of decisions that were made by state and other institutions in terms of how they commemorated the centenary.
Definitely. So in both Britain and France, the representation of Muslims, particularly as 2014 progressed, was of this increasingly militarized, increasingly violent other. Remember that in the summer of 2014, this was the moment when the rise of ISIS was on the front page of all the tabloids. And in Britain in particular, there was a growing narrative that there were more British Muslims fighting for ISIS than there were in the British army. That's not true. That's never been true. But this was the narrative. And it corresponded to this long-standing notion that Muslims were, say, potential enemies, potential opponents to the British nation, and that Muslims were somehow unassimilable into the dominant narrative of what it meant to be British or French. So these are not new narratives, but they were particularly violent and particularly salient narratives that fed into Islamophobia in both countries at the beginning of the First World War centenary. So that's one aspect of it, and that certainly shaped the way that Muslims were represented in the centenary. At the same time, there were other tensions and there were other perceived threats to social cohesion in both countries. So this was 2014. In Britain, this was during the coalition government, Tories and Lib Dems, and it was before Brexit. But in a lot of the narratives, a lot of the speeches by politicians that marked the beginning of the centenary, there was a very real, very palpable sense of Euroscepticism that pervaded them. So Cameron, for example, said that, now 100 years ago, we had our differences and this led to wars. Now we still have our differences, and as frustrating as it may be, we hash these out around a table rather than going to war. So that, it was kind of a jab, really, at the sense of that there hadn't really been any reconciliation. There was still this natural animosity within Europe. That those same narratives didn't play out in France in the same way. There was a celebration of Franco-German friendship and reconciliation. But in Britain, certainly Euroscepticism informed the tone of the centenary, and informed a sense that this is what would characterize Britain's memory of the First World War. And then finally, I would say in both countries, but particularly in Britain, there was increasing prominence that was given to the memory of empire, but it wasn't named as such. There were lots of references to the Commonwealth contribution to the First World War, but there was no Commonwealth in 1914. It was the British Empire. But by renaming it Commonwealth, by remembering it that way, it created a way to reimagine really a violent empire as a community of brothers fighting for a common cause, and as the predecessor to multicultural Britain. And that was pitted largely in opposition to European tyranny. So this again is much more obvious looking back on the centenary than it was at the time, but certainly there was a very strong narrative of a celebration of multiculturalism and then an imposition of that onto the past. Alongside that came an erasure of the violence of the imperial past, and the fact that this was not a multicultural community bound together by a common cause, but a multicultural force that had been coerced into fighting a war that was not of its choosing, and who fought in very hierarchical ways and were commemorated differently or not commemorated differently on the basis of race and religion.
You're listening to 3CR 8:55 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB radio. We're currently talking to Dr. Meghan Tinsley about war and memory. Meghan, down here in this little corner of the empire, I guess the idea of World War I as being the crucible in which the Australian spirit was born on the beaches of Gallipoli is sort of a more recent invention. It's something that's emerged in the 90s as part of the Howard government's trend towards this patriotic nationalism. But with that, it has also come this sort of gaslighting idea that it's always been like that. In the UK, there's this sort of almost religious reverence for the poppy. I wonder, how long has that been the case? Has it been 100 years of this, or is this also a more recent invention?
Oh gosh, this is the poppy is really a fascinating story, and I think it has a very recent. Well, it's taken a recent turn even since the book was written. So originally, the poppy it's a reference in a lot of First World War poetry to the poppies in the fields of Flanders. So even before the cloth poppy on the lapel became a popular symbol associated with the remembrance of the First World War, that notion of red poppies did symbolize the blood of Flanders fields, the blood of soldiers spilt in the war. The poppy itself emerged as a symbol in the 1920s, so it was fairly soon after the end of the First World War, and it was for the Hague Fund. So it was a fundraising activity to raise money for veterans of the First World War, and in particular those who had been injured, gravely injured at war. It did become increasingly popular in the latter part of the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War. But I would say it really took off in the 21st century and took on a life of its own, really, going up into the centenary. Alongside that, there was the rise of the white poppy, so as a symbol for peace, which is still a fundraiser, and the No Glory in War campaign continues to raise funds by selling white poppies. You'll see occasionally purple poppies for animals killed at war. There's a book by Stephen Bourne called Black Poppies, for the memory of soldiers of African descent who were killed in the First World War. And I've never seen a black poppy on someone's lapel, come to think of it, but the black poppy does symbolize the deaths of black soldiers in the First World War. So in that way, the poppy has taken on a life of its own that goes well beyond its original meaning. But even more recently, it's almost become, it has become this camp symbol of militarism, of really unreflexive celebrations of war rather than the memory of the dead. So if you attempt to buy a poppy today and go online to do so, you're also going to find poppy onesies, poppy zippers, poppy reflectors, poppy tennis shoes, poppy thongs. It really is in the realm of the absurd. And alongside the proliferation of poppies has come the stigmatization of not wearing a poppy. So recently, Rishi Sunak released a photo of himself with his wife and their dog, and all three of them, including the dog, were wearing poppies. There's a Twitter account called Poppy Watch that really takes off at this time of year, where they just showcase the absurd lengths to which people go to showcase their patriotism wearing a poppy. And then in my own research, I came across a London fashion student, Tabinda Kausar Ishak, who designed a poppy hijab, and her her logic, her argument was that Muslim women frequently were not visible, were not foregrounded in commemorations of war, and that there was a perception that this was a memory that was irrelevant for Muslim women, and that by extension, Muslim women could not participate and be patriotic, with regard to the First World War. So this was a fashion item and a religious symbol, and something personal that Muslim women could do to remember the First World War in their own way. But, alongside that comes another way to exclude Muslim women who don't wear a poppy, who don't wear a poppy hijab. That's really a long-winded discussion of a complex and changing symbol that I think maybe, this is just to hazard a guess, I think the poppy is in decline, if my own observations are anything to go by now. I see far fewer poppies on the lapels of people on the street than I did 10 years ago, or even at the beginning of the centenary. And I think that might be because the public has become saturated by poppies. It no longer symbolizes the memory of war if it's just everywhere. If you're going to see it, regardless of whether or not you choose to wear one. And it is, I think it's increasingly clear that the poppy is a racialized symbol. One of the Islamophobic tropes that resurges on Remembrance Day of every year is that Muslims don't wear poppies, and also that people selling poppies have been told not to go into Muslim neighborhoods because it'll be considered offensive there. Like, there's no evidence that that's ever been the case anywhere, but this is one of the tabloids that just seems to perennially resurge around this time of year, that Muslims are unpatriotic because Muslims don't wear poppies. And, and to combat that, there have been, school children, Muslim school children selling poppies, and then these very self-conscious media accounts of, celebrating these children for commemorating the past that it might not be popular to remember. So the poppy is deeply politicized, and it really has saturated popular memory of the First World War, and it's continuing to change every year.
With regards to Australian nationalist mythology, the Gallipoli campaign is often portrayed as being the part of the birth pangs of the Australian nation, when Australia came to, rank among the countries of the world. It was a military disaster. It involved, enormous death and suffering, and yet it's been looked upon as, I guess, historically important, as being the crucible in which the Australian nation was formed. World War I itself was, brutal, slaughterhouse, millions died. These are very bloody events that are being commemorated in various different ways, but I'm wondering if you can speak to why it is that war in particular plays such a crucial role in nation building and in cementing, I should say, some kind of nationalism, nation state.
That's a big question, and I think it's a really important question as well. I'm going to answer it by appearing to skirt the question, but I promise I'm not. I would argue that it isn't war that's fundamental to nation building, but it's the memory of war that's fundamental to nation building. If we imagine that war is a time when entire communities of people who would have very little else in common would rally around a common cause and would rally under the state and under the authority of the state, with a willingness to sacrifice their lives and to sacrifice their comfort and their everyday life, everyday activities in the service of a greater good, that's almost never what war actually is. In fact, I would even venture to say that is never what war is. War is always contested. There is always opposition, even if it's violently punished. The state is always contested, but that isn't how we remember war. We remember war as being a time of selfless sacrifice and of consolidating the nation as an idea. I've been talking primarily about the First World War, but I think this is much more apparent if we think about the Second World War, because that war has been so overtly politicized in Britain recently, with commemorations of the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Very frequently in the right-wing press, you'll see claims like, during the Second World War, you didn't have people protesting in the streets and claiming that Churchill was racist, calling for vegan sausage rolls and wanting all of these special modern comforts. That's not true at all. The Second World War was actively contested. Protests were a regular fact of life, including during the Blitz. And guess what? There were special ration cards for vegetarians. So none of what are presented as the contemporary fractures of society are unique to this time. The idea of the nation is always contested, and it always has been. But the memory of a war as a time of national unity creates the idea that it is possible to have a singular sense of what the nation is and of who belongs and of who the enemy is, who the other is against which the nation is constructed. So I would argue that war doesn't unify nations except by violent coercion, but the memory of war does unify, certainly not every single member of the nation, but does present a singular narrative of what the nation is and what it has been.
As well as these wars that are fought on the battlefield, there are also all around us culture wars being fought every day, and statues and street names are one front in that culture war. Could you tell us a little bit about why these are so important to some people?
Well, first of all, just calling it a cultural war is political, isn't it? Because if wars are imagined to unify people, then cultural wars are imagined to do the same. And I think that's what people who use the term cultural war, to claim that the nation is under attack, that's exactly what they hope that the term will do, is rally the people against this imagined enemy, of wokeness. Anyway, but your question was about statues and monuments, right? So the past is complex, the past is contested, the past is fragmented, as I've noted before. Statues erase all of that by setting the past in stone and by imagining that incredibly complex histories and also incredibly complex historical figures stood for something singular, and that they were singularly superhuman and heroic. So when we, so when the state, usually here elites, erect a statue, they are taking the complexity and the nuance and the violence of history and then transforming that into a single clear-cut idea of who a person was and of who should be celebrated. Viewed in that way, simply erecting a statue is a very ahistorical thing to do. It erases the complexity of the past. So for all the charges that pulling down statues are, these are acts of erasing history, really I would argue that erecting a statue is erasing history, and pulling one down is reclaiming the complexity of past and present. Pulling a statue down is also really people in the present acting in solidarity with people who wrote counter-narratives, with memory activists in the past. Anyway, claiming that a statue represents history is a powerful way of writing a single narrative of past and present. And it's much easier and much more palatable to claim that Churchill, for example, is a figure who stood against fascism and stood for this British Blitz spirit that represented unity in the face of violence and oppression, keeping calm and carrying on, and all of those narratives. That is a much easier narrative than to say, okay, yes, all of this is true, but also Churchill was a racist. Also, Churchill did claim that Indians were, I think the quote was, a beastly people with a beastly religion. Also, Churchill was responsible for famine in India under the Raj. And also he did bomb German civilians during the war. That's just to take one example. And it is a particularly contested example. Churchill as a figure is hotly contested. But that is a much more difficult history to grapple with. To say that a human being who's been upheld as a national hero was deeply flawed as an individual and shouldn't be reduced to this figure that we venerate by erecting statues. So back to your question of the purpose that statues and monuments serve, they serve the purpose of reducing the violent complexity of past and present and the fragmentation of the nation into a singular narrative that can be celebrated and that can be rallied around. That process is never complete. Statues never serve the total purpose that they're intended to. For one thing, they tend to fall into ruin, they decay. So for all their proclamations of superhuman figures and national heroes, they will eventually decay, and those figures will be forgotten. This is just what happens over time. They can also be splashed with paint, with the word racist in spray paint, as happens to Churchill's statue in Parliament Square. In some ways, statues make it easier to contest history, because if statues represent these heroic figures, the ease with which they can be challenged and even pulled down demonstrates what's flawed about those narratives, demonstrates that people are not beyond the tumultuous nature and the fluctuations of history. So statues do serve an important purpose for national memory, but the fallibility of statues demonstrates the limitations of relying on them to remember the past.
Sometimes in debates about nationalism and national memory, there's a distinction made between a more wholesome or perhaps palatable form of patriotism on the one hand, which is intended to be inclusive, and an exclusive notion of nation or nationalism. Do you think that distinction has any real utility or validity? And how do you think those with concerns about decolonisation, of anti-imperialism and so on, can deal with the notion of nationalism, and can it be rehabilitated? Do you think that's a worthwhile project?
In a word, no.
That's fine.
So, yeah, I have more words. They're coming. Right. So you said at the beginning that patriotism is a soft version of nationalism, or that it can be read that way. I think what's important to remember is that patriotism is nationalism by another name, and nationalism by definition is exclusionary. We can't proclaim who we are, the general we are, without imagining an other. We can't imagine who belongs without having an idea of who doesn't belong. This is just inherent to nationalism as a project, and that absolutely includes liberal nationalism. To proclaim that a nation stands for fairness, stands for tolerance, stands for inclusion, implicitly, or sometimes explicitly, claims that other nations don't, and that anyone who doesn't subscribe to this particular set of values has no place in the nation. That is inherent to the project of nationalism. There's really no way around that. In practice, it's even worse, because this notion of liberal values, of say, civic nationalism or patriotism, was constructed historically through the violent opposition of those who were seen to be unassimilable through the project of empire. I mean, one example is Algeria under the French Empire, where in theory, Algerian colonial subjects could become French citizens, but they had to renounce this imagined idea of what it meant to be Muslim in particular. And this was not what it actually meant to be Muslim, but it was the French imperial state's understanding of what Muslimness was. So Frenchness was constructed in opposition to this imagined Muslim other. It is a long history. It isn't unique to the 21st century at all, but we can certainly think of examples in the 21st century, where, for example, in the Netherlands in 2006, a video was introduced, and applicants for residency were required to watch a video that included a woman walking topless on a beach and two men kissing. And the government's narrative was that if you can't stomach liberalism, then you have no place in the Netherlands. Well, not everyone was required to watch that video. Migrants from the EU or from North America or from Australia and New Zealand were not required to watch that video, because the presumption was that they shared these liberal values. By extension, the claim, the explicit claim in this case, was that people who were not white, not Western, and in particular Muslims, were seen as having values that were incompatible with liberalism. So this is, these are examples of so-called liberal nationalism, of patriotism, that are seen as a soft alternative to nationalism. But really, just beneath the surface, there's a violence, and there's an exclusionary claim about who can belong and who can't. And that is a very racialized narrative. So no, I don't think that patriotism is a palatable alternative to hard nationalism. I certainly don't think that the left, that the center left, should entertain these notions of appealing to patriotism as an alternative to hard right nationalism. I would argue that we need to be honest about the past, that memory is inescapable, and collective memory is something that we all appeal to, whether or not it's built up at the national level. So there's no escaping it. But what is it that we're going to remember about the past? Are we going to appeal to statues when we think about the past? Are we going to find solace in imagined national heroes? Or are we going to be honest about the past? Are we going to be honest with ourselves about the violence of empire and the ways in which it was actively forgotten throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries? I would argue that only through honesty about the past, in all of its complexity, in all of its nuance, in all of its violence, can we begin to work towards a future that isn't bound by national borders or national narratives, but is bound up with the decolonial project.
Well, Megan, that's all we've got time for. Thanks so much for joining us. If people want to find you on Twitter while it still stands, you are at Megan E. Tinsley, or you are on Mastodon at Megan E. Tinsley at mastodon.green. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, Andy, we will be back next week. Global Intifada is up next. See you later.
See you then.
There are now 189 people on hunger strike. 62 have sewn their lips together, including 2 women and 5 children. For Woomera, this isn't an unusual day.
We have an old saying in Persia that says there is no darker color than black. So when we're in the camp, we have 2 options. Either deporting us back to persecution, to prison, to death, or die in the camp. But I think you guys give us a 3rd option. which is another try.
They bent like half-cooked spaghetti. We didn't expect it to happen like that, to the soundtrack of Amélie, a popular French movie at the time, blowing across the desert from dusty speakers. The fence began to fall, under the weight of people wanting justice, under the weight of people that had had enough.
Join us for Woomera Stories on Monday, November 21st and November 28th at 6 p.m. on 3CR.
This afternoon, already they've set up camp only 200 metres from the Woomera Detention Centre's main gate.